Welcome. This guide will be focused on dungeon tanking as a paladin in Classic WoW. There is already a lot of information about raid tanking out there, so we will not be covering any of that here. Let's get started. Before I cover 1 to 60 as Prot, I need to mention that if you are a solo player, and if this is your first character on a new server, then I would highly recommend actually leveling as Ret. Before level 40, Pursuit of Justice is the highest impact talent available for leveling. In the level 30 to 40 range, you'll be looking at contested zones, and Ret is the only way to get any burst at this level range through Seal of Command RNG and Incapacitate stun damage. Prot spec really starts to open up around level 41 with Consecrate, Sanctuary, and Plate Gear. At 46 you'll have Reckoning, and at 51 with Holy Shield, I would say that Prot is better than Ret for getting to 60. Mainly because you'll have all the Maraudon weapons, which will last you comfortably to 60, whereas Ret Paladins have to go out of their way to keep up with weapons. Not to mention all the AoE pulls you can do while questing and tanking previous dungeons. With that out of the way, let's talk about 1 to 60 as Prot. If you're into roleplay and you want a sword and board from 1 to 60, you could spec Redoubt first. You don't really need Consecrate to tank DM, and you'll have it by 25 for stockades where you also still don't need it. Outside of that, we could just rush Consecrate because we're going to be using a two-hander with SOR anyway. So our first option is Strength or Intellect. And the only guaranteed way to get Int on mail and plate gear before BRD is to just buy it off the auction house, because quest rewards, dungeon loot, and crafted gear are all going to be strength-based. So while I recommend Int for endgame, Strength is going to be better while leveling unless you are diligent about buying Eagle gear. Our next option is Spiritual Focus versus Imp Seal of Righteousness. Technically, you could go back into Strength or Intellect, but you really don't have the stats at this point for that to matter at all. Imp SOR is a fairly negligible increase early on and even at late game, so usually I wouldn't recommend doing it, but you could if you wanted to. I think Spiritual Focus is a much better choice here because it's going to come in handy for PvP and PvE healing. It's also going to open up more pulls for you early on, especially in that level 20 to 40 range, where it can really make the difference between whether or not you run away from a couple mobs or you fight it out, which to me is very valuable. That being said, there really is no wrong choice on either of these sections. So let's get down to Consecrate. Now at this point, we're level 20 with Consecrate. If you want to AoE at this stage of the game, you will need to have Engineering and get yourself some Coarse Dynamite. Otherwise, just keep your two-hander on and don't bother casting Consecrate solo, because you just won't have the mana pool to really do it yet. So moving over to the Prot tree, Redoubt is an easy choice here. You're going to be using Ret Aura, and Shield Spec is actually nice. So at this stage of the game, if you can find a blacksmith to make you shield spikes, you might have better odds with AoE, but I wouldn't quite count on it just yet. We're going to do 3 out of 3 hit next, and we're kind of at an interesting spot here because you could start putting points into toughness now if you wanted to go for 5 out of 5 toughness, but Guardian's Favor is really nice for utility, so I like to put my points there. On the next tier, Righteous Fury is an easy choice. We're going to want that to help us downrank. It's really nice early on. Can't really go wrong with it. Now, we also have more toughness choices here. One of the options is you could take a point out of Kings and put it into toughness. That being said, I really like to run Kings. People like that buff, and I play Paladin to make people's day better, so you just can't go wrong having it. 2% armor is a choice, though. We're going to do 3 out of 3 shield spec here. And technically, yet again, you could put these into toughness if you really wanted to. But that being said, you can see that at this point, we can easily throw 3 points into toughness to get us down to the next tier anyway. I personally like to run Imp Hammer of Justice here. It's not a particularly good trade. I mean, it is, 6% armor versus 15 seconds off hammer. Most people are going to go with the 6% armor here, but I'm just kind of throwing it out there for the interest of transparency. Now, Anticipation, we're just going to ignore altogether. You can see that we have all these other choices, so there's really no reason to bother with getting defense here. Upon achieving level 41 with Sanctuary, everything is now in order. We should be able to pull 3 to 5 mobs at a time, no problem, even more with Engineering and cooldowns. We'll go ahead and get Reckoning next. That's going to help us proc Judgments in our AoE farming, and it's going to provide some much needed PvP kill pressure. We're going to go ahead and finish out the rest of the tree here, and considering we're level 51 now, we got all the goods. Somewhere on the path to getting Holy Shield, you should have gotten Mara out of the way. Otherwise, now is the time to complete that dungeon. With Thrashblade, Fist of Stone, and Hypertech Buckler, you are well on your way to level 60, AoE everything you can, and tank dungeons you need for gear. The lower half of BRD is damn good with 1.12 loot, and you can do the Oni chain there, so you should be able to spend a considerable and profitable amount of time in that dungeon. We'll finish by putting our last 9 points into Holy. You're going to want this for raid healing, and even dungeon healing to be more effective. Illumination is a minimum requirement to be a good healer in progression rating. While 5% crit is noteworthy for healing, as Prot we're going to make up for that loss by being better at farming consumables solo and helping our guildies run 5-mans. It'll all work out. We have one flavor point to work with here, and I would suggest the most pragmatic position is Imp Lay on Hands. I personally like to put it on Fear Resist because I get a chuckle every time I resist a fear, but you do you. I highly recommend healing Ubers as tanking it is quite difficult early on and will really stress your mana conservation skills on Rend, and all the bosses in there hit for trucks. You can easily tank everything else, but this one pseudo raid is going to require more mitigation and effort than I recommend bothering with at this point in the game. You'll also want Tooth and Gnaw from Ubers, so healing will just make acquiring that easier anyway. The bare minimum to be a Paladin tank is to have plate gear and Consecrate, which means that any spec that runs Consecrate is, by default, able to tank dungeons. In fact, Holy builds are actually ideal for mana conservation, which I'll explain at length in part 2 of this guide. But for now, putting points into Prot is going to improve quality of life while gearing up and gold farming. During this time, we will want as much extra damage, threat, and mitigation as we can get. At higher levels of gear, you will have a plethora of specs to choose from. The first build we're going to look at is 20-31-0. We built our way up to this spec while leveling. It's a pretty standard build for anyone interested in raid healing and dungeon tanking. Only real difference now is that we have int instead of strength, since strength does nothing for us while healing, and we can get a few more spells off as Prot. This next spec is similar to the last one, but more PvP oriented. We're looking at 25-26-0. You can see that we're really only moving 5 talent points around and then changing our flavor up. Now, unless you have a Deathbringer early on, there's plenty of excuses to use a two-hander, so you won't need that one-handed spec 24/7. Divine Favor is a much better PvP cooldown than Holy Shield. In PvP, when you cast Holy Shield, people will really just laugh at you, whereas a free fat crit heal can turn the tide of a battle. We can now acquire Imp SOR without any real sacrifice. You'll want Holy Shield for gearing up and AoE farming later on, but once you tire of it, you could consider switching to this spec for PvP purposes. I also recommend this spec if you find yourself spamming Holy Shield and running out of mana a lot. If you can't control yourself, then just get rid of the temptation. I'll cover more of that in the next video as well. The foundation of any good piece of gear is the Eagle. Int and Stam are the building blocks of your class, and the more you have, the more you can do. It really is that simple. If you keep this in mind while looking over upgrades, you'll be able to make better choices and enjoy your time playing Paladin. First, let's take a look at this BiS list that I linked in the description below. The first thing you will notice is that there is no Deathbone. While Deathbone is a great set of gear, it is also a very low drop chance from Skolo, which is one of the harder 60 dungeons. You're going to need to wear something in the meantime. Lightforge is easier to obtain and has a nice buffet of raw stats to work with for any fresh level 60 Paladin. It's simply a more useful set overall, whereas Deathbone is only for tanking. It's also worth noting that you will likely get your Deathbone set over time if you farm Dark Runes, and it never hurts to have more gear options on hand. That being said, you will be replacing all of these slots with tier gear eventually, so keep that in mind. A number of these items would not be nearly as good if it wasn't for 1.12 itemization. Let's take a moment to thank Blizzard for Breastplate of the Shaman King, Spritecaster Cape, Naggle Ring, Cyclopean Band, and Baxorian Gauntlets. These gauntlets are particularly interesting because they drop off a rare spawn in Ubers, who also drops the Arcanite Reaper pattern. If you haven't befriended a blacksmith for shield spikes yet, this is a great time to take advantage and get out there and help someone so that they owe you one. While this list is reasonable to obtain, I have Iron Foe here despite it being a notoriously low drop chance. Because if you ask me to pick only one weapon, that would be my 24/7 weapon of choice. Let's talk about the reasons why next. So first we need to discuss weapon speed. Fast weapons are best for proccing Judgment of Light and Wisdom. They also offer higher TPS over the course of a fight because spell damage scaling on SOR is not affected by weapon speed. Slow weapons are best for reckoning damage and initial threat on fights. Of course, the quality of weapons that you currently have on hand can change things, as well as your spec. But since we're running Reckoning, I look at it like this. Fast weapons for judgment effects, slow weapons for everything else. Nice and easy. This means you always want to have one of each weapon type on hand. For fast weapons, we're going to start with Fist of Stone. Since it has its own built-in wisdom proc, it's actually a really nice weapon. That being said, we can look at upgrades at some point. Flurry Axe is going to be best in slot for the entire game when it comes to proccing judgment effects. The fact that it's a mid-level weapon with a weak damage range is actually a bonus, since you won't be killing mobs faster than you need to. Hand of Edward the Odd is really only good if you're looking to go out of your way to be in situations where you need to heal yourself. Keep in mind that you may not need to heal yourself in some of those same situations if you were using Flurry Axe with Judgment of Light instead. I find it particularly good for two-man farming Stratholme trash with a mage, but outside of that, I don't know if I could justify spending money on it personally. There's plenty of other weapons in this range, like Mira Song and other things that have raw stats. I'm just listing the weapons that I find interesting, which tend to usually have some form of proc. Silent Fang and Soulbreaker are two such weapons that are 1.6 speed and do something that you don't normally have. As for slow weapons, Thrashblade is pretty dang good. I wouldn't bother going out of my way to upgrade it until I had something like this on the list. Lifesteal procs tend to be pretty good since they scale with spell damage. These weapons also have nice damage ranges. Demon Fork also drops off the same mob who drops Backstory and Gauntlets, so odds are you will encounter this if you're farming the previous list. For pretty much every other use case, Iron Foe is the king. I'd also be curious to see how that compares to Flurry Axe, 2 procs versus 1. I assume Flurry Axe is still going to win out, pretty hard to beat, but it's also really not an easy weapon to get. So for right now, probably don't expect it. Let's cover shields real quick. There's not a whole lot of ambiguity on this section. Pretty much any shield will serve you well. On this list, Argent Defender and Sacred Protector are the only 2 shields that come from quest rewards. It's worth noting that with Argent Defender, the quest reward also offers you a lightsaber, which a lot of people take because it looks cool, only to shortly find out later that it sucks. Take the shield, you might want it. I'm personally looking forward to Crest of Retribution and Skullflame Shield myself, but like most things in this game, at the end of the day, you're just going to have to pick whatever you like the most. This will conclude part 1 of the Paladin Tanking Guide. I hope you found this useful. In the meantime, take it easy.